I had the privilege of serving under Nelson Mandela in South Africa's first democratically elected parliament. This came after a history of over 350 years of racism and, of course, the apartheid system, which was a system of legally binding racial separation and oppression. When I see the plans for annexation of up to 30% of the West Bank in occupied Palestine, I cannot help but think of the South African apartheid system of homelands and Bantustans. Because what this annexation will do is it will make Palestine further fragmented, meaning the possibility of a Palestinian state gets reduced. It will give Israel and its quite brutal military and security services even more control over the daily lives of Palestinians. All of this is being undertaken in clear violation of both international law and UN Security Council resolutions. So it will further the illicit nature of the already illegal occupation of Palestine. Israel, with the Nation-State Act that defines citizenship on the basis of ethnicity, is unfortunately harking back to apartheid South Africa. The annexation of more and more of the occupied Palestinian territories reflects the homeland or Bantustan policy of apartheid South Africa. In some instances, the Israeli state has imposed a system of apartheid on the Palestinians in a manner more efficient than apartheid South Africa managed. This is, for instance, reflected in the reality that occupied Palestine is so easily controlled, is surrounded by walls and fences in many instances, but also that Israel has built separate roads for Israeli citizens and Palestinians, respectively, to use. Palestinian motor vehicles in Israel have different registration plates to those of Israeli citizens. So very sadly, having experienced South Africa, both growing up as a privileged white in the apartheid system, but also being involved in the struggle against apartheid with the ANC underground, and then serving in Nelson Mandela's first democratically elected parliament, and also experiencing Israel and the occupied territories both through my work on the global arms trade and as part of a delegation of South African human rights activists that visited the West Bank, the parallels are disturbing and overwhelming. Let us never forget, one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen, Nelson Mandela, stated publicly that we are not free until the Palestinian people are free.
Like the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Those territories should be returned to the Arab people.
There has always been a very strong link between the forces for liberation in apartheid South Africa and the Palestinian people, because we come from a shared history of oppression and occupation.
It is no use for Israel to talk of peace if they still hold on Arab territories which they conquered during the Six-Day War in 1967.
During the South African apartheid years, many in South Africa and conservative supporters of the apartheid regime globally argued, why single out South Africa? The reasons were very clear. This was one of the only states on the planet to have legalized, entrenched racism, where dependent on the color of your skin determined where you could live, what schools or universities you could go to, what jobs you could do, what public facilities you were and weren't allowed to use. So basically, your entire life was determined by the color of your skin. The reason that apartheid South Africa was further singled out because of its legalized racism and systemic abuse of human rights. Sadly, the reason for the focus on Israel today is not dissimilar. We focus on Israel because through its nation-state law and through its illegal and brutal occupation of Palestinian territory, it is not only creating an environment in which racism is entrenched in law, but it is also repressing and oppressing the Palestinian people on a daily basis, determining what they can and cannot do, determining whether they can get to schools and universities, determining whether they can get to employment opportunities or not. And this is being implemented in a manner that very closely resembles South African apartheid. So we focus on Israel today because it is one of the worst violators of human rights, because it does determine citizenship on the basis of ethnicity. And crucially, we focus on Israel, especially as Jews, because we believe that given the suffering and racism against Jews for thousands of years, most obviously encapsulated in the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered simply because they were Jewish. We argue that we as Jews should, wherever we find it, call out racism, call out oppression, call out discrimination, because we know the true consequences of racism, discrimination, and oppression. 39 members of my mother's family were murdered in concentration camps. I was forced to leave my own country, South Africa, in the mid-1980s. And the night before I left to avoid serving in the apartheid military, I remember thinking to myself that I'll never see my home country again. Because at that point, nobody could foresee the end of apartheid in South Africa. But just 5 years later, as a consequence of international solidarity, of sanctions against the apartheid South African state, the ANC was unbanned, Nelson Mandela and his colleagues were released, and a further 5 years after that, Nelson Mandela became president of a democratic, united South Africa. A country with enormous challenges, but a country with extraordinary hope and a future to look forward to. I believe implicitly that the same thing can happen in Israel and Palestine, but only once we respect and value the life of every single human being.